This is for Almighty, sits at home waiting for my call. 1,000 Pine Points, being here first. Welcome Joe, James, Eric. All right, Susan. West Australia, still on the map. Are you from West Australia, Vaughn? Okay, I thought this conversation, this interview between Alex O'Connor and Justin Brierley was very interesting. I'm not going to play all of it, but I watched most of it at around 2x, 3x. I'm going to rewatch it now with you guys. I'm going to set it to 1.5x. I think they talked slow enough that we can do it. In the first half hour, they talked about something that I really don't find that interesting, and that is the definition of atheism and what it means to be agnostic. But I have a question for Christians. I say this, and you label me with however you want. I say that I don't believe that there's any gods of any sort. I don't live my life like it's true that gods exists, Yahweh exists, any God exists. I don't live my life like it's true. But I don't say that I know for sure. I say that I could be wrong. I'm open to have my mind changed. I have markers in my life that I think would change my mind. I've listed those markers in previous videos. What would you call me? Christians listening, Muslims listening. Am I an atheist or not? And I've asked this question to some Christians, and they end up saying, no, Doug, you're not an atheist. You're an agnostic. But now let's flip the script a little bit. So I'm asking you, Mr. or Mrs. Christian, do you admit you could be wrong? That maybe there is no God, or that your particular God is wrong, not existing? Well, yeah, Doug, I could be wrong. Do you have markers in your life that would change your mind? Like, for example, find the bones of Jesus? Yeah, Doug, I do. I have markers that would change my mind. Okay. So would you admit that you're not 100% certain then? Yes, Doug, I'm not 100% certain that Christianity or a God exists. So then why don't you call yourself agnostic then? Instead of being a Christian, why don't you just call yourself agnostic? With maybe Christianese-like leanings. If I'm not really an atheist, but really agnostic, then maybe you're not really a theist or a Christian. Maybe you're just agnostic. You see? But they wouldn't do that. They wouldn't say that. They would say, no, I'm definitely a Christian, not agnostic. Welcome, Kaylin. You're welcome, Derek. Oh, welcome, Joe. Good to see you here. We have at least one theist in the house. Don't leave Christianity, Joe. Whatever I say, don't leave it. But the title of this video is Why Be a Christian? And that's a question I've asked Christians often. And believe it or not, they struggle with answering that question. Because it's pretty easy to answer that question if you're messed up in life. So, but someone who is relatively stable, is not crazy, is good to their fellow humans, acts kindly, lovingly, is a good parent, a good contributor to society, doesn't have any existential angst or tragedies or health problems. Why? I'm describing myself. Why do I need Christianity? Why should I be a Christian? And whatever answer the Christian gives, so Christians, if you're listening, whatever answer you give, expect a so what as soon as you answer it. So anticipate that so what comment coming. And then what would you say? So if you say, well, you need Christianity to, as we'll hear in this video, in order to have a basis, a foundation, a justification for things like intelligence, reasoning, and so forth. So anticipate someone saying, well, so what? Do I actually need this belief in order to go shopping, to buy groceries, to look both ways across the street? So what if someone has zero justification for their rationale? So what? Well, it just makes me feel good that I have this true justification for things like logic and intelligibility. Now, some people answer that way. What's another answer that you've heard? Why be a Christian? Well, it's because you can't have any moral foundation. You can't tell, and this is also in this video coming up, you can't tell people what to do and what not to do unless you have some gravitas behind it. Otherwise, people can just say it's your opinion. So you need a God. You need a God backing your words up. And if you don't have a God backing those words up as a foundation for morality, then it's just opinion. But you should anticipate the question, so what? Does having this foundation make people more likely to be moral? And many times Christians will admit that non-Christians, I'm not just talking about atheists, that non-Christians are as moral, if not more moral in a lot of cases, than Christians are. So what? Why do you even need this God for morality as a justification, as this objective moral standard? So what? And isn't this just the God's opinion, Yahweh's opinion of what's right and wrong? Why should we listen to his opinion? He could be a bad God. And if you're defining goodness and badness based on your God, then you basically are just saying a tautology. God is God. God's not good. God's God. His nature is good. And even if it was the opposite, if his nature was opposite, it would still be good by definition because God's God. You see the problem here. So the best answer, Salim, welcome. He's giving an answer, why become a Christian? Because it's true. Now you should anticipate a guy like me saying, so what if it's true? So what? Does the fact that it's true going to save my life? Now some Christians would even say yes. Without Christianity, you are more likely to die because you're going to do drugs or you're going to be immoral sexually and it's going to have more diseases. But that, I think you realize, is not true. There are many truths, plural, in this world that, Salim, you are totally ignorant of, that you're totally unaware of. Why do you need to know those specific truths that you are currently ignorant of? So just the fact that you might believe Christianity is true, and let's say even it is true for the sake of argument, so what? Why does someone need to believe it? And the best answer, in my opinion, is because of the pain of hell or the pleasure of heaven in the afterlife. I think that's the best answer a Christian can give of why someone should become a Christian, because they will admit that life is just a vapor, that life comes and goes in a snap of a finger. You've seen Endgame, right? I might vanish now. Can I do that? I probably could, but I won't try. I can poof myself, but I can't slowly vanish. So life is just a vapor. So it's really about the afterlife. That's when the real party begins. So why should you become a Christian? Because of heaven and hell. I think any other answer other than that, someone can very easily say, so what? You don't need to be a Christian to behave well to your fellow mankind. You don't need to be a Christian to pay your electric bill. You don't even need to be a Christian to have your life radically changed. This one really bothers Christians when they find out that people's lives have been radically changed, that they've gone from some terrible addiction to no addiction without Jesus. I tell you, that shakes their world when they realize that you don't need Jesus to overcome addiction. Anyhow, welcome, Eric. Let's start the video at the point where they've finished talking about atheism and theism, and they're talking about, here, I'll play it.
It's good to see people who are willing to change their minds. I have a question about whether your ability to say, I might change my mind, I might be wrong, is it unfair to characterize that as doubt?
Depends what you mean by doubt, doesn't it?
Only because,
I don't think of it as doubt. I think of it as a willingness, as a form of humility, I think, to say I could be wrong. I think doubt is a bit different. I think that's more when you are sincerely questioning or
I really appreciate Justin Brierley saying that it's a form of humility to admit that you could be wrong. But how many Christians are willing to, how many pastors are willing to stand up in front of the pulpit, give this great sermon, and at the end of the sermon, look into the audience, look into the congregation and say, you know what? After all that I've just said, this message, this beautiful sermon I just gave, I could be wrong. Now go and have a great week. How many pastors have you heard ever do that?
But is that not what you're doing?
Well,
with the show?
I would say I'm always open to questioning things, and I've certainly gone through periods of doubt, and there are things I am not certain about, or I have not made sense of yet within my Christian faith. So in that sense, yeah, if you want to call that doubt, that would be doubt. But I don't have significant doubt in the core claims of Christianity, if that makes sense. In as much as I'm not wondering, are they true or are they not true?
Sure.
I'm convinced that they are true to the best of my knowledge.
So as certain as that I'm sat across in the room from you, is that the kind of level of certainty we're talking?
This is a brilliant question by Alex, and it's a question that I've asked Christians many, many times. And whenever you hear a Christian say that I am confident, I am certain, I am convinced that Christianity is true, always try to compare it to something else. And something that is so blatantly clear. Like here Alex is saying, are you as confident that Christianity is true as you're confident that you're having a conversation with me right now? And most Christians, honest ones, will admit, no, I'm not. I am more confident that things will fall when you let go, or that I'm having a conversation with you across, this desk right now, than I am that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. But a lot of Christians are actually terrified to admit that, especially publicly. I can tell you from experience that a lot of Christians think that it's a sin to admit that publicly, because all those who deny Jesus in front of men, God may deny them in front of Jesus in heaven. Well, actually, God and Jesus are the same person, apparently. So, yeah, there's that fear to even admit that they're more confident in these earthly things than in Christianity.
I think that it's a different kind of trust. So Christians often talk about faith, and faith in a sense is something that isn't about looking at something and it being right.
You're welcome, Reed.
There in front of you. Mm-hmm. It's about trusting in something on the basis of evidence that you've been given for it. So it might be more akin to trusting that the chair I'm going to sit in is going to hold me up, right, even though I don't have absolute proof of that. You know?
Yeah, and it's a clear, you hear this analogy often, faith is about trust, and so it's sort of like this chair that Justin's sitting in. But we would know quite clearly, Justin, when your faith in that chair has been misplaced, and that would be, you would fall to the ground. The chair would break, you would fall to the ground. So what is the markers in your life, Justin, that would convince you that your faith in Jesus Christ has been misplaced? Hey, thank you for the donation, Jordan Alex, $5. I prayed to PineCreek for a promotion at work, and I got the promotion. Praise be to you, PineCreek. Well, that reminds me of a story. A friend of mine had this allergic reaction. It was like a grapefruit sown in his face, and it was like grotesque. And then he thought of PineCreek. He wrote a check out to PineCreek, and poof, the grapefruit was gone. The allergic reaction went away. And I don't know from miracles, but to me, that was a miracle.
It could be you loosened the screws before I came in here and it was all going to collapse or something. But I trust you as a person. I trust, that you haven't done this as a prank. It's so there's a kind of that kind of level of trust is the way I would probably characterize my Christian faith. Sure, is that I obviously have never seen Jesus standing in front of me as you stand in front of me, Alex. But I have a number of other aspects of my experience that make me trust that Jesus Christ is true.
So you spoke about the
Yeah, he has other experiences that show him that Christianity is true. This is where I think non-Christians or atheists in particular, agnostics, whatever, should really focus in on is how many people on this planet can say the exact same thing as Justin Brierley. They have these experiences that just demonstrate that X God is true. And often these gods are contradictory to the gods that Justin believes in. Justin, if you ever listen to this, it is more probable, it's plausible that every single experience that you attribute to the God that you worship and serve, it's probable that what you attribute to is wrong. Wrong. It's probable that you're lying to yourself just because of the fact that there's thousands, if not tens of thousands of religions out there where you have experiences that you would say what they attribute those experiences to is wrong. And if we're having an even playing field here, you can't just say, well, my experience counts and theirs don't. My experience is true and theirs aren't. And then he'll say, yeah, but we got all this textual evidence. Mm-hmm.
The core aspects of Christianity that you believe are true. People have different ideas about what they are. So obviously there's the resurrection, like you point out, 1 Corinthians 15. If Christ has not been risen, you're still in your sins, your faith is futile. Very clearly, that has to be a component of the Christian belief. What else to you lies in the real core of Christianity?
Well, for me, you could probably sum it up in something like the Apostles' Creed. I mean, that's what the creeds were developed for, was to give us sort of an easy-to-view way of looking at what are the core beliefs of a Christian. So that would include the deity of Christ, that Christ is divine, that he lived, he died for our sins, and that he rose again. The Holy Spirit, it's a Trinitarian conviction that I hold. So those would be some of, I suppose, the key elements. Yeah.
And are you non-denominational?
Well, I do belong to a denomination, but I'm non-denominational. You could say I'm non-denominational as far as the show goes. I hear from a wide variety of perspectives.
Does anybody know what denomination he actually is in? I don't think he says it here.
There's different denominations when it comes to Christianity. And in the book, I'm very much advocating for what C.S. Lewis called a mere Christianity, which is to say, we're not going to get into the long grass of all the various things you could debate over various doctrines.
Okay, this bothers me. This whole idea of mere Christianity, this is a huge cop-out in my opinion. And it's not just among Christians. Muslims do this, I think, as well. It's like they have reasons to cherry pick, but they're cherry picking what they're going to view as what Christianity is. And this is why I side with more the Calvinist precept type guys, is because do you believe the New Testament or not? Do you believe the Old Testament or not? Do you have confidence that what you read in these books are true? And if so, you're not just talking about mere Christianity, about a man rising from the dead. You're talking about all the details that come before it and after it as well. Why do you just pick that? Well, because the scripture says that this is what Christianity is all about. But that scripture is based on other scriptures and foreshadowings and, well, what they call them prophecies. I really think guys like Justin and other apologists embrace this idea of mere Christianity because it makes their life so much easier. They don't want to have to do the heavy lifting of defending every single thing in their holy book. And I don't blame them. I would hate to have to do that. But it's like, if you have this belief, if you're going to say, I believe this book, I revere this book, then own it. Own it, defend it. Just don't say, oh, yeah, some of it I don't go for. Some of it I do. Well, how do I decide? Well, that's just obvious. That's false, but this is obviously true. It's like
final positions on various things. We're just going to say, was Jesus Christ who he said he was? Did he rise?
Yeah, is Jesus Christ, is he who he said he was? Justin Brierley, I would submit to you, you don't even know what Jesus said. And I'm using know in the strong sense of the word. Like, that you're having a conversation with Alex O'Connor right now in this interview. Do you know what Jesus said? Do you even know what Jesus believed? When you compare the word know to the fact that you're having a conversation with Alex O'Connor right now, I would submit you have no idea what Jesus said compared to the fact that you're sitting across from Alex O'Connor right now. That type of knowledge is not even comparable. You think you know what Jesus said. You think you know what Jesus did because a book says so. Now, are you going to stick to mere Christianity now, or are you going to spread that mere Christianity out a little bit to say that you now have knowledge of all these other details of the life of Jesus and the sayings of Jesus and so forth?
From the dead.
See, this is the problem with mere Christianity right here. It's within seconds.
If so, we've got pretty good grounds for believing that Christianity is true.
Yeah, but before you even get to Jesus, you need to start with his dad, and that's where you kind of begin trying to put forth these arguments for the existence of God. So, well, look, why don't you try to convince me? Why don't you talk me through some of these arguments? Let's see what they're made of, why they're convincing, and areas in which I might disagree with you.
I mean, well, any one of these we could take the whole show for. So maybe we should start with one or two of the ones that I know you.
Okay, take a guess. For those of you who haven't seen this, take a guess in the chat. What's the first thing Justin Brierley is going to say to Alex O'Connor to convince him that Christianity is true? Hey, thank you, Derek, for the donation. Appreciate it. We'll take the kids to Outback Steakhouse later.
You've been most keenly engaged with, and one of them is the moral argument.
Yeah,
obviously.
I think it'd be good to focus on that because I do want to get into the problem of evil as well, which is something I haven't really talked about on my channel before, and certainly not on the podcast. And I think the two are somewhat linked. They're different questions, but they lead well into each other.
And that was kind of where the whole Frank Turek thing came from as well, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, the way I put it in the chapter is that I believe God makes sense of human value in a way that a naturalistic worldview cannot. And so it's as simple as really pointing out.
Yes, Reed. It's similar to the moral argument. It's it's the moral argument, the obligations and duties to your fellow human.
That a lot of people believe that there is an intrinsic value and dignity to human life, that somehow we should treat humans in a way that we're not obliged to treat the rest of the world, the living world. And even, some humanist manifestos, I don't know if you think of yourself as a humanist, Alex, but they're obviously the ethical framework that I meet many atheists that they hold is some form of humanism. And if you look at some of the declarations that have been made around that, they seem to very intrinsically hold humans as having a special status. And we have whole documents of human rights, the UN Declaration of Human Rights. We had the 70th anniversary of that recently. And the question is, well, if these human rights, this human value, this intrinsic human dignity does exist, if people are agreed on that, how do we ground that? And my view is that theism, Christianity specifically, is a good grounding for it, because a Christian believes that God has created humans in his image. That gives humans sort of intrinsic dignity and value and worth. And in fact has shown that as well in his death on the cross in trying.
Okay, so his first thing that he said to Alex O'Connor on why he should be a Christian is because you can't ground human worth, human value without God or without Christianity. I don't know if he would, without Christianity. He would go so far as to say that. Now, what would you say if you were Alex? What would you say if you were having this conversation on the street? I would recommend there's several ways to go with this. But the obvious question I would ask is what I asked earlier. So what? Why does one have to ground it at all? Now, that's for the more intellectual types, that's not a good way to go. It's like, well, we should have justifications for what we believe and so forth. But in actual fact, there's people of very low IQ on this planet. There are, 10% of this world has an IQ below 75? Is that right? Actually, probably more than 10%. Very low IQ, but great people, honest people, loving people, caring people. They don't care about their grounding, their justification for how they treat others. They just, I treat these people well because I don't want to get hurt. I'm not going to hurt them. It's as simple as that. So the so what question is not a bad one of so what you need to have it grounded. But the better question, I think, is what if you could ground it even better without Christianity on the value of humans? And this reminds me, I wonder if I still have it here. Yeah, this is something that when we're talking about explanations, this is something I think I stole this from Sam Harris. I'm not sure. Adapted it from Sam Harris. But here we have 5 things. How do we ground our moral obligations to our fellow humans? The same way I think, or why do these moral obligations seem to even exist? I would say that we can ground them through evolution. And there's a reason why, let's say, dolphins will treat other dolphins in a different way compared to other species. Why rats or hamsters, same thing, will value their own species maybe a little bit more than, let's say, a bug on the floor, and so they'll eat it, butterflies and so forth. And so the question I've asked in the past is, if you had to destroy these one at a time, what would be the ranking of guilt? Where would you feel the least guilt? You have to destroy one of these 5 things. Well, you'd probably have the least amount of guilt destroying this rock, blowing it up. Then maybe the leaf, and then maybe the butterfly, then maybe the rat, and finally the dolphin. Why is that? sorry to say that the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Quran, all these holy books cannot explain that. The holy books cannot explain why your level of guilt goes up as the species becomes more like our own, either through intelligence or appearance or whatever. Evolution can't explain that. A holy book cannot.
In reconciling humanity to himself in that way. But I don't find any justification for that belief in a naturalist atheist view of reality, where we are, in a sense, a somewhat random byproduct of an evolutionary, a purposeless, process of evolution. I don't see in a world that is essentially, you can boil down to matter in motion, molecules and so on, where this intrinsic dignity and value lies. And I suspect you might say the same, because I know you're a subjectivist when it comes to morality, that there isn't any objective standard out there to which we're...
I mean, it's complicated because it sounds as though, and like, I think you're right, but perhaps for the wrong reasons to call me a subjectivist. It sounds like you are just trying as hard as you can to avoid subjectivism, moral subjectivism. It sounds like your argument is based on the idea that we must have some conception that people are valuable as a matter of fact, and that it is wrong to throw acid in the face of a girl. FGM is wrong, and we need
I believe
to
that is wrong. I believe it's subjectively wrong. All I'm saying is that if you hold the belief that it's wrong, that it's objectively wrong, and that humans do have some intrinsic value, then you can't believe that your naturalism won't support that.
And to be clear,
your naturalism can't support that. That's just false. Naturalism can support that. It helps for the surviving of a community of species, to treat your fellow species a certain way, a way that doesn't destroy them. So you can ground it, you can support it. But here's the problem. For guys like Justin Brierley and for Christians watching right now, the idea that we humans are animals doesn't go down well. It's not palatable. It just feels gross to them to think that we're animals. It is much more pleasurable for the Christian to say, I am a creation in the image of a deity. I am so loved. I am so valuable. I have so much worth because a God created me. Like, doesn't that sound wonderful? Now, the flip side sounds horrible. I'm an animal. And when I'm dead, and when my kids are dead, or so, nobody's going to remember me. Nobody's going to care that I even existed. I'm just a compilation of cells made up of molecules and atoms. I have no real purpose here. Now compare those two narratives. Now you understand why I think we evolved to believe in deities. It helps us survive. It's like humans have this need with a capital N, capital EED, to be loved, to feel special, to want to have purpose and meaning in our lives. And when you believe that this all-powerful deity cares about you, I tell you, that makes you feel so special, doesn't it? And the opposite of that, you're just an animal. Oh, how can you guys believe that? This is, I think, how the typical Christian thinks. That it's just, but here's the problem. There's so much evidence for evolution that there's like gears start to grind, that evolution is a real problem for many Christians. And you're going to see this coming up with Justin.
You're not saying that people who don't have a belief in God or some higher being can't have those moral convictions.
Oh, no. And that's the big mistake that often gets made.
People
confuse this idea that what I'm saying is atheists can't be moral people.
Yeah.
That nothing could be further from the truth. Many of the atheists I know are incredibly moral.
They can't justify them.
So if atheists can be moral people, then you don't need a belief in a deity to be moral. But according to Justin, you need the belief to ground it. But again, the question could be, so what? Why do you need to ground it? And if you don't like that question, you can ask, or you can make the comment, well, we can ground it on evolution, based on evolution. Now, you don't like that grounding, but poo-poo. So what if you don't like my grounding? Why is your grounding better than my grounding? And the answer they'll typically give is, well, because we got gravitas, because otherwise it's just opinion. But we got a God that his opinion counts because he made everything.
I don't believe they can justify it on the basis of their worldview.
And that's because...
And it's a kind of a leap of faith almost that takes place when they say, but I just believe humans have this intrinsic value and dignity. And I'm like, well, great, so do I, but I don't believe you have a grounds for believing that.
So why does God provide that basis in a way that atheistic worldviews can't?
Well, simply because I think if we are created in the image of God, and God is the creator of everything, and God is the ultimate source of good and value and love, then there seems to be a natural, relationship there between us having been endowed with this specific value that we recognize.
Right.
And I can't give you a mechanistic account of that, obviously.
Course, yeah, but
that was a great question, and I didn't really hear an answer there. Like, why does God ground it?
And dignity. And I'm like, well, great, so do I, but I don't believe you have a grounds for believing that.
So why does God provide that basis in a way that atheistic worldviews can't?
Well, simply because I think if we are created in the image of God, and God is the creator of everything, and God is the ultimate source of good and value.
Okay, what his answer really is, because if it's true, then it's true. So the question is, why can you say that only God can ground these things, and the naturalistic view cannot ground these things, like human obligations and value? Well, because if Christianity is true, then God is the creator of and gives us meaning and value, blah, blah, blah. He's just saying that, well, because if it's true, then it's true. Then our grounding is true. If our grounding is true, then it's true.
And love. Then there seems to be a natural,
seems to be a natural what?
Relationship there between us having been endowed with this specific value that we recognize.
Right.
And I can't give you a mechanistic account of that, obviously.
Yeah, but
I think that it makes more sense of our fundamental belief if we have one.
Sure.
Yeah, see, that's a horrible answer, Justin. If I were you, I would have said the grounding from God is better than the grounding from evolution because there's more oomph behind it. We're talking the guy who created everything, and if he says we have value, then we have value, and if he says we should treat each other well, then we should treat each other well. Why? Because he's the creator, and he can smack us if we don't, and punish us if we don't, and he can love us and reward us if we do, and his word goes. What he says goes. I think that would have been a better answer.
Sure. And so when it comes to, because it does come down to the idea of being made in the image of God, I presume that you're somebody who generally accepts the scientific literature on evolution.
Yeah, I mean, with
Salim, this is the evolution part that you were talking about in the live chat. Yes, Justin Brierley does believe in evolution, but watch what happens here when Alex questions him about evolution and moral duties.
some caveats, but I'm very happy to say if that's the best explanation going, then that's the best explanation.
Right, and that's a good way of looking at it. So, but my question would be something like, if human value is predicated on the idea that human beings are made in the image of God and that they are special, they have some kind of special worth, and if you trace the evolutionary heritage of human beings, you get back to a kind of apish ancestor which doesn't resemble humans and clearly wasn't made in the image of God. So I struggle to get my head around the idea that
if I was a betting man, and I am, I bet Justin Brierley does not believe that.
we can have a kind of a fish.
That we came from fish, or that we have an ancestors that predate us that were ape-like. I really doubt Justin Brierley. I think he's more conservative than he lets on.
And then billions of years of evolution. And at some point along that chain, okay, round about here, this is where we're now in the image of God. It seems like if you're made in the image of God, there needs to be this immediate creation of humanity as it exists, because otherwise you run into a problem of degree.
Yeah.
That's an excellent point or question by Alex. If you believe in evolution via common descent, which a lot of Christians do not, especially in the United States, but if you do, if you're a Christian who believes that we are related to leaves and grapefruits, at what point where did God infuse life with his image? Like, there is strong evidence that there was interbreeding between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Like, at what point, how much DNA, what percentage DNA of Neanderthal has to drop before we're in the image of Yahweh? Or are Neanderthals in the image of Yahweh? Were they created in the image of Yahweh? Like, And the sad thing is there's so many Christians who don't even believe that Neanderthals existed.
Yeah, and this is an area where I wouldn't claim to have massive expertise, but I'd say...
So, I mean, the question would be something like, where like a chimpanzee is our closest ancestor, are they sort of close enough to the image of God to have some semblance of that moral dignity?
Well, I would say for anything that is non-human, that is a different species or whatever, the way we treat that...
See, but this is the thing. If you believe in evolution via common descent, Justin Brierley, the definition of human has been transitioning. Well, in order to get to human, there was a transition. What we call human Homo sapien today, there was a slow, gradual transition to that point. And this is Alex's brilliant question. At what point do we have this image of God and value being placed? Like, is the value of a Homo sapien the same as the value of that dolphin I just showed? Most Christians say no. The human's worth way more than the value of a dolphin. Why? Because God said so. Now, evolution's explanation is because these are our own species. We tend to value a species closest to our own.
Species, that animal, we need to do that as a reflection of our God-given image, if you like. And so it's incumbent upon us to treat things in ways that reflect the compassion and everything else that God has built in us. So I wouldn't say that the belief in the intrinsic uniqueness, if you like, of humanity means we can just do what we like with the rest of creation. It's that. But coming to your point about when did this, when
does God start caring?
Gets sort of put into humanity, I don't know. Is the honest truth. It could be, I'm speculating here, that there was a moment at which God endowed a primitive pair with conscience and a kind of an awareness of him and morality and everything else. That could be one way. It could have been some kind of slow process in which that accumulated into a group or whatever. I don't know. All I do know, in a sense, is that we do believe we're special. We do believe there's something special about humanity, and that and I believe that is best grounded in the idea that we are made in the image of God. How exactly that came to be is open to speculation. And we have a story in the Bible, obviously, in Genesis, which I think is a great analogy, a great piece of poetic literature that tells us we're created for a purpose and to reflect God's image. But it's not giving us a scientific account of that. And that would be, and I've done debates on when that happens, I'm kind of somewhat agnostic, if I'm honest, on that. I don't know, and I don't think I may ever claim.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of Christians listening to Justin here and not liking his answer. I can put myself back into my Christian shoes, and for Justin to say, well, there's this slow transition from our ape-like ancestors to Homo sapiens, and Justin saying, I don't know how or when God did it, but at some point he took his fingers and went poof. This species here is now special and created in my image. But just before that, no. A generation or two before that, no. But now, here. Or maybe the Neanderthals were 50% in my image, and then as the breeding kind of subsided and it was more like evolving to Homo sapiens, it went to 70% in my image, and then 100%. Christians are not, many Christians are not going to like an answer like that. That's why there's guys like Ken Ham in the world, and guys like, the creationists would say, oh no, that's clear cut. It's just like, this is simple. It's Adam and Eve, and that's where it started.
Yeah, because Christianity seems to quite clearly draw a distinction between human beings and other animals, and very much press their specialty, and that's what we do with something like human rights as well. We say that humans are of their own kind. And yet, Peter Singer makes an interesting point on this, which is that whereas we would lump oysters and chimpanzees in this category of animals, we have a complete divide between chimpanzees and us, even though we are far closer to a chimpanzee than an oyster is. And can you see the problem with saying that the morality that we have is grounded in the fact that we're made in the image of God, and yet if you go back not that long ago in terms of evolutionary history, maybe 200,000 years or so, there are different species of humans. Do Neanderthals have the same kind of image of God?
I'm kind of agnostic on that. It could be that God has purposes and ways in which he was, in some sense, those Neanderthals or whatever had some kind of moral sense or whatever. I'm not in a position to know. All I do know is what I can tell from my experience now about humans and the way that we are distinct from the rest of the animal world.
Do you see it as
this whole idea? This is actually, I don't know if this frustrates me or it fascinates me, but you can just feel, you can just, it's like oozing out of Justin, and it oozes out of a lot of Christians. It just, this whole idea of I'm special is oozing out of these people. And not only that, it's like I need to be special. And okay, let me explain this to Christians listening right now. Is it Dave Robertson? I thought I saw him in the chat. I think I'm explaining it to this type of Christian. I'm familiar with Dave Robertson in the live stream chat. Here's my perspective on this whole morality thing. When you go to the zoo, and this is, by the way, this is my advice on how to talk about these things about morality with a Christian who leans conservative. Talk about animals at the zoo. When you see animals caring for their young, protecting their young, showing what I would say love, caring for their young, protection. When we see it in other animals, we just call that a behavior, but we don't stick the word love to it or goodness, moral goodness to it. We don't call it a moral good thing to do. But when humans do it, then we do call it a moral good thing to do. When we look at animals, even animals of the same species kill each other, which happens often. When animals of the same species kill each other, we just call that a behavior, a negative behavior maybe, or just instinct or intuition or whatever you want to call it of the wild. But we don't assign any moral attributes to a chimpanzee killing another chimpanzee. We don't say that that was murder or immoral. But when humans do it, then we do call it a certain special word that we call immoral. So for the Christians listening, for guys like me, that's how I view things like compassion, empathy, and murder. That these are behaviors very similar to what we see in chimpanzees and other primates, other animals that show love, caring, compassion, and even things like stealing, theft, murder. We just use special words to describe those things. But really, a lot of the same behaviors we see in other animals, we do. What we do, we see in other animals. Now, hang on to your seats now, Christians, if you're listening, if you're still here. This makes us not special. If you're a Christian listening, you are not special. If you're a Muslim listening, you are not special. You're one of billions of species called Homo sapiens, and you're not special. Am I allowed to do this? Am I allowed to say to people, YouTube, is the YouTube algorithm going to get rid of me now? Am I going to cause anxiety attacks in humans? Am I saying things that is new and novel that I'm going to be banned from YouTube forever by looking people in the eye and saying, look, you're not special. You really aren't.
Serious challenge, this evolutionary history.
I don't really know, because for me, it's all it is it gets us to the same position. We're humans, and we.
By the way, if you teach your kids that they're not, you can teach them that they're special to you, but in the big scope of things, if you teach your kids that they're not really special, it helps them be a little less obnoxious. They actually get a little more humility.
The majority of us seem to have a belief in this intrinsic value of humans, whatever evolutionary pathway that took, or whether it was a special creation at some point of a first human couple, or whatever it was, or if it was a young Earth creationist belief, that it was all started 6,000 years ago. The point is, we're all presented with the same point of view now, and all I ask atheists to do is to consider why, if the naturalist account is true, and that all of this is actually from a purposeless process, why we have this special regard.
Simple, and I think Justin could answer his own question. Why do we have this? I don't remember what Alex says here, but why do we have this regard for our own species? Because we evolved this way. Just the same way a mother lion, what do they call it, lioness, has this special affinity for her own cubs or her own tribe. We have this for our own species.
And I tell a story in the book. I don't know if you got to it in the...
Joe De Pilato asked, do you tell your kids that they aren't special, Doug? Yes, I do. I tell my kids in the big scope of things that they are not special. I am very much the type of father who tells my own children that you're not special. Don't expect life to be fair to you. In fact, not only is life unfair, but it will never be fair to you. Never. And so I set the expectations very low. And I believe that when you set your expectations on life extremely low, you actually end up being happier because you're not disappointed. You're expecting life to suck.
The chapter that I talk about it, but I managed to have a kind of mini conversation with Richard Dawkins along these lines. He was doing a debate in Oxford with John Lennox, who's a well-known Christian thinker.
At the Natural History Museum.
At the Natural History Museum. I mean, this would have been well before you ever were engaged in these things. This was back in 2008.
I think I was about 8 or 9 years old.
Yeah, exactly. So this makes me feel so old, Alex. That's the problem.
Makes me feel so young.
But anyway, I managed to sort of do a sort of little interview with Richard Dawkins in the kind of after-show party, as it were. And in fact, do you mind if I literally just read out the book? Because that will do a better job of it than me trying to recall it off the top of my head. But I essentially sort of ended up asking Dawkins about whether he believes ultimately that our morality is derived from a sort of godless, purposeless kind of evolutionary sort of standpoint. And this was how the interaction went. And tell me what you think of it. I said, but if we'd evolved into a society where rape was considered fine, would that mean that rape is fine? And he said, well, I don't want to answer that question. It's enough for me to say that we live in a society where it's not considered fine. We live in a society where selfishness, failure to pay your debts, failure to reciprocate favours is regarded askance. That is the society in which we live. I'm very glad. That's a value judgment. Glad that I live in such a society. And I said, but when you make a value judgment, don't you yourself immediately step outside this evolutionary process and say that the reason this is good is that it's good, and you don't have any way to stand on that statement? And he said, well, my value judgment itself could come from my evolutionary past. And I said, so therefore it's just as random in a sense as any product of evolution. And he said, you could say that. In any case, nothing about it makes it more probable that there's anything supernatural. And I said, okay, but ultimately, your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact we've evolved 5 fingers rather than 6. And he said, you could say that, yes. And I think that's a consistent position to take.
Yeah, it's consistent, but it's troubling, right?
But it's troubling because none of us live like that.
And I think Dawkins recognises that it's troubling when he says something like, you could say that, yeah. Instead of just going, yes, absolutely. Yeah. It's like a kind of,
now, this conversation took place before The Moral Landscape came out by Sam Harris. And after that, he then said, I used to say, oh, it's all...
Yeah, it is troubling. And I think we have evolved that way to view it as troubling, things like rape and murder and so forth, especially when it happens to the people we're close to. Like how many times have you guys personally cried, like wept because of a murder or rape from someone 10,000 miles away or across the ocean to some stranger? Like, sure, you'll say, oh, that's horrendous, that's terrible that happened to this person. But has it really impacted you? Now, when it happens to someone you love, then it's really troubling. And it's also troubling. Now, get this. If you want to hear what's troubling, probably, what is it? Homo sapiens have been around 100 to 300,000 years. Probably 400,000 years ago or 500,000 years ago, our ape-like ancestors. Do you think there was consent in sexual activity and reproduction? Probably not. Do you think there's consent amongst dogs, cats? No. But we have evolved, Homo sapiens have evolved in a way of highly community organized species with a deep sense of empathy and compassion, which has helped us survive as a community, to call certain actions like rape as wrong. Other species have not evolved the same way. They don't ask permission to have sex. You realize that?
Well, subjective, but actually I think now there is an objective case. But I think you've done a very good job, Alex, in...
Joe De Pilato, I use my pessimism as therapy too. Yeah, I don't know if I call it pessimism or just realism, that life's unfair and it always will be, and that you should expect... when you expect the world to basically just smack you around, if you don't expect anything good, I think it really does help. Like, you should plan for and expect nothing but hardship. And I tell you, when you seriously believe that, and if you look around, it's not too hard to actually, in countries like the United States, we have it so good. But when you look at the majority of the world struggling, the world is getting better in my opinion, but you look at the majority of the world struggling, it's not easy to really believe that the world is unfair and it's going to slap you around. A lot of you listening, probably in the next 10 years, will be diagnosed with a terrible, terrible disease. I recently got diagnosed with macular degeneration. Good chance I'm going blind. Life's not fair.
Showing why this is not objective, the moral landscape by Sam Harris.
Yeah. So, like, I'm interested to see what you make of this, because to me, moral subjectivism is not as simple as. So I've got in your book, which I can also quote from. You've said, for this reason, and it's kind of discussing the things you've just been discussing, many people claim that morality is entirely subjective. You say, this means that there are no universal standards of good and evil, but that individuals decide for themselves what is right or wrong, depending on their cultural circumstances and personal point of view. Now, to me, that kind of confuses moral subjectivism with moral relativism, and they're often thrown in the same bag. But I believe that to be a moral subjectivist isn't to say that morality varies by culture. You still run into the problem of
I don't know how much of this moral part. They get into a different topic, and I actually forget what topic it is, but I have a timestamp here. But let me give my view on morality, just so I have it on record. I've talked about it before, but I think guys like me and Justin Brierley are not that much different when it comes to morality. I think guys like Justin Brierley, and probably Christians in this live stream chat, I think they would say that they define morality based on the nature of their God, right? Am I right, Dave Robinson? Am I right, Salim? You would say what's good and what's bad is defined by what your God says or does or wills, or what outflows from the nature of your God. Now, but you, Salim and Dave Robertson, you could have chosen to be, I think, as long as you're not Calvinist, I think you would say that you could have chosen not to be Christians. You could have chosen to be Hindus, Buddhists, Taoists, whatever. And you could have different standards of morality. You could have your standard morality different than Yahweh. But you have chosen from your own free will, your own subject. I think this is how you would phrase it, that you have chosen to worship and acknowledge and define what's moral from the nature of your God. Whereas a guy like Alex O'Connor and myself, I think I can speak for Alex, that we define things like morality based on a different standard, not the standard of Yahweh's nature, but the standard of, let's say, well-being or unnecessary suffering. So just like Alex and I have subjectively chosen that standard, and I'm not so sure it's subjectively chosen, I think we've evolved that way, but anyhow, let's say we subjectively chose that standard. Guys like Justin Brierley have subjectively chosen the God they worship and serve. And I would say that my standard is superior to the Christian standard. And why do I say that? Because I think to have your standard of morality based on God, based on Yahweh, is to, at many times, to divorce morality from human suffering. And you can very clearly show that. Here's a great question that Christians don't like to answer, and that is, if Jesus inflicted the worst possible suffering on all of humanity starting tomorrow for, let's say, 6 hours, would that be morally good? Most Christians, if you can get them to answer it, they would say, yes. If God inflicted the worst possible human suffering on all the humans on the planet for morally sufficient reasons that we are not aware of, that by definition would still be morally good. And I would say that would be morally bad based on my standard. Now, the Christian standard, they would have to say the worst possible human suffering is morally good for 6 hours. My standard, that's not good. Mine's better, I think. But that's my opinion, right? And but your standard is based on God's opinion. And just because God created the universe doesn't make him right, does it?
the ground.
Okay, I'm going to fast forward it here to a new topic. And I honestly forget what this topic is. Oh, it's free will. Yeah, this will be fun.
being, and that he's fully divine but also fully human, and it like
I don't think in order to achieve a just society, I have to convince people of all those things. I think that a good, flourishing society comes out of certain Judeo-Christian principles, like the intrinsic dignity of human beings and that sort of thing. I mean, we're going around the houses here, but all I'm saying is I think that the Christian story provides a better framework for justifying that than a naturalistic story. I accept that you believe that you could find these sort of shared subjective goals, if you like, of pleasure and pain. I have to yet hear how you would persuade someone who simply doesn't exist in your worldview.
Alex O'Connor, if you ever watch this, here's something you should add to your repertoire. It's my poof or drown question. I would have loved to... Alex, if you ever talk to a guy like Justin again, ask them about their preferences, not their accounting for or their basis for morality, but ask for their personal preference on whether the God they worship and serve should have poofed someone out of existence or drowned them, as in the case of the flood. Or you just pick any atrocity in the Old Testament or even New Testament, like Ananias and Sapphira, who got killed for withholding donations. Like, would you prefer God poofed them out of existence or killed them either through a heart attack or whatever? I think in that case they just dropped dead, so that's close to being poofed. But you get the point. And what you'll end up seeing is the Christian will, the only go-to, and from my experience, the only way they can get around this is to say, well on what foundation, on what basis do you say that's wrong, Doug? Huh? You answer me that. They have to turn it around to your point of view. And then if that happens, just be like a little child in their laps and say, sorry, I can't justify anything. I'm just a poor non-believer, non-Christian. I can't do any. I'm here to learn from you. Just give them all the power they desire and all the control they want. But just ask, but I'm asking your opinion. What's your preference? Would you want God to act this way, or would you prefer him acting a different way? I tell you, Alex, if you ask questions like that, they'll start sweating.
Alex, which is, let's be fair, been very highly conditioned in the West by a Judeo-Christian ethic up till now. Well, we could debate that. But the point is, there exist many cultures still in the world, and certainly historically, where they have a very different view of the worth of human beings, and some human beings simply are worth less than others. And for me, how you distinguish between who's got the right view of humanity is going to be more than simply showing that we ultimately have the same subjective preferences for pleasure, because I think people are a way off that in certain cultures and places.
Well, to me, that just sounds exactly like the same problem that you'll have religiously speaking. Like, yeah, okay, I have to convince people of my view of pleasure. You have to convince people of your view of religion. So, I mean, your argument seems to be that in order to have this objective basis, you need there to be some God, some transcendent being that can be the grounding of morality.
Yeah.
And I'm suggesting an alternative. And so it can't be enough for you to turn around and say, well, look, I can see how you could go about doing that. I just think it's easier to do it through religion, because the whole argument rests on the idea that there is no other way to explain it than through God.
Sorry, I suppose the point I'm making is that even you're, I think, prepared to admit that you're not giving us an objective foundation for morality. No. There are no actual moral facts and values that exist out there.
I suppose what I'm saying, though, is that you don't have to.
Yeah, I get that, but the point being that I'd have to hear your arguments about that in detail, but I can't see how
This is key. You will hear this from theists and Christians in particular many, many times. I can't explain. I don't know how. I can't understand any other way. This has to be true.
I'm spell that in detail, but I can't see how going to a culture where they simply have a different view on the value of women or children or whatever it might be, and they treat them in certain ways, how without some objective reality about the way we should treat people, you're going to convince them. You might end up convincing them. You might say, hey, actually, you guys need to rethink the way you think about.
Yeah. See, this is so exciting to me. This actually pumps me up a little bit. What Justin Brierley is saying is, without this objective standard, you have no oomph, no gravitas, no reason, no foundation, no reason to say to someone, stop it. Because they could just say, well, why? That's just your opinion. And then Justin Brierley says, No, 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 no. This is not my opinion. This is the big guy's opinion. And so Christians and Muslims especially think that because there's this God out there who is the foundation for morality, then human beings can tell other human beings how to live. But now listen to me closely, Christians, if you're still here. You're wrong. And here's why you're wrong. Because even if your God exists, even if Yahweh is real and true, a guy like me could say this: Justin, why should I obey your God? If your God says X is moral or X is immoral, why should I care what your God says? Now, there's going to be a knee-jerk reaction in the Christian. They're going to say, well, because he's the creator of all things. He is the sustainer. He's all these great... They're going to list a whole bunch of things. You wait for them to be done, and then you say, so what? So what if he's the creator? Why should I obey your God? And what it's going to boil down to is exactly what Alex O'Connor is talking about. I fast forward a part, but it's on the topic of well-being and pleasure and pain and so forth. And the only thing I think that the Christian could say at this point is because of pleasure and pain. But eternally, you should care about what God says, because some of them would say because you'll live a better life, you'll have a better life here on earth, but the smart ones won't even go there because they realize that being a Christian doesn't guarantee you have a better life. So the only thing they can really say is, you ought to obey the big dog, because if you don't, you will suffer in eternity. Or if you don't, you will not get a reward in eternity. This is basically all they have left to say at that point. Why? Now, there's some Christians, though, that will say you should obey God because he can see the future. He knows what's best for you. Now, that's a great answer if there's any evidence that it actually works. Can you show me? This is Hitchens' favorite. You remember Hitchens' favorite challenge to Christians or theists in general? Show me any good action, good deed, moral, what we call moral, that a Christian can do that a non-Christian can't. That was the Hitchens challenge. And you can't find it. Any good deed that a human can do to another human, a non-Christian can do, that a Christian can do. And there's no evidence that Christians, because they have access to the Holy Spirit or this omnipotent, omniscient deity, that they have any advantage over a non-Christian. I used to think that, people's lives were so messed up because they're not Christians. And then the older I got, the more I realized, no, some people's lives are just messed up because of circumstances are out of their control. And a lot of times just because they make stupid choices. And so it wasn't a matter of being a Christian or not, that Christians, like non-Christians, make bad choices or have bad circumstances, good choices and good circumstances.
The way you're going to achieve the things you want. But, if you're going to go to Genghis Khan, who was in a position to do exactly what he wanted, whatever way he wanted, I don't think he's necessarily going to say, you're absolutely right, Alex, for the well-being of the whole of the species, if I want to I shouldn't go around raping and murdering and pillaging, because he's in a position where he says, don't care, I'll do what I want, I'll fulfill my desires exactly what I want, because I'm in the position to do so.
I see your argument, but and I hate to kind of keep pressing this, but do you not see how it's precisely the same in the reverse? You say, I see what you're saying, Alex, but I just don't see how you can go to another culture that simply has another conception of pleasure to the one that you do and convince them, I don't see how you could go to that same culture who simply have a different conception of God than you do. It's the same problem, and I don't know why your answer is better than mine.
But I think we're talking cross purposes then, because I'm not saying I have to convince them of my conception of God in order for them to be able to accept my moral framework. I'm saying if we have an agreement, if someone believes that there is an objective way, an objective type of morality that exists, then that can only be justified on God. So, like I say, I'm not going to a culture and saying, here's why God exists, therefore you have to act this way. I'm going to the people who already believe that there's an objective moral facts about the world, like babies shouldn't be raped, and saying, if you believe that, I can't see how it can be grounded in naturalism, but I think there is a good explanation in theism.
And this is,
Yeah, now Justin is just going back to grounding. Again, I would say to the Christian, number one, so what if someone can ground or not ground something? Does that affect behavior? Pragmatically, I'd say no. And Justin's admitted that. And number two, I think you can have grounding for things like morality. And you can even call it objective morality that's outside of any one individual human or even one society, one group of humans that sort of surpasses that expanse, and call that objective, and you don't need a deity for it. And another thing is, here's another question to ask guys like Justin Brierley, or even Christians in this live chat. Here's a good question to ask. I had what's that guy's name? Sam, the guy who believes in Krishna. I had him on my channel, and he believes in a personal form of Krishna. And I asked him point blank, and he says he gets his morality, his standard morality from Krishna, a version of Hinduism. He was a Hare Krishna type of guy. And I would ask a Christian like Justin Brierley, do you think Sam, the Hare Krishna guy, can ground morality based on Krishna? Because it's not human grounding, it's not naturalism grounding, but it's a grounding, it's a type of grounding that based on a deity that I think Justin Brierley would say does not exist. I know Justin Brierley would say Krishna doesn't exist. So this issue that Justin Brierley is talking about is not a atheist issue. It's a Christian, non-Christian issue. And this is what I was battling with, what's his name? Gregory Kokel about the other time. And he actually ended up agreeing with me. This is a Christian worldview versus non-Christian worldview issue. And so Justin Brierley needs to own his belief here and saying that not only the naturalists, not only they cannot ground morality, but no one else can other than Christians. And maybe even he would go so far as say Christians like me. I don't think he would go that far, but
I suppose what I'm doing is I'm saying, if you believe that, then here's why I think it's grounded in pleasure. And I would actually say that and you say, well, if you go to another culture who has a different conception of pleasure, like, I don't think that that's metaphysically possible. I think that the way I'm defining pleasure is essentially what is wanted when experienced. Well, it has to be a good thing, but that's
yeah. I know time is running out.
Yeah,
so I really this is what I've been, because I've been watching a few of your videos, Alex, right. And last time you came in, or it might have been the time before, we ended up at the doorway as you were leaving my studio, talking about free will, and I think this does link into the morality thing.
Okay, now we're finally talking about free will,
because I think I know that you believe free will doesn't exist. Okay, and I think that creates a double problem for the moral question. Because obviously, you believe that morality is subjective. Ultimately, there's no objective standard by which we can, even if we can kind of come to some subjective agreement about what it would take objectively together. But on top of that, and I think you're absolutely consistent with a naturalistic worldview that if matter and molecules is all that ultimately exists, then we do live in a deterministic universe, and all of us are essentially could not have done otherwise than we do. I think that also presents a significant problem, because not only can you not does it mean that when people do bad things, we're not in a position to say they've done anything objectively wrong? We're also saying they couldn't have done anything other than what they did. Yeah. So they're not morally blameworthy.
Yeah, there's no praise or blame.
And that, for me, is obviously a huge issue for the whole moral thing. And I know you've done a few debates.
Yeah, I mean, you're not alone. Like, that's one of the biggest problems. For me, the question is, what is true? If it leads us to a disturbing conclusion, like the idea that we can't actually say someone is responsible for their actions, like, if it's true, then tough luck.
By the way, if you're a Christian listening, this is the toughest question I think you can ask a non-Christian, or a atheist in particular, a naturalist, I should say, is the whole idea of moral praiseworthiness or moral blameness. That's a tough question, but my answer, like, because if you believe in determinism and someone has done something, killed another person, let's say, why would you blame them? Why would you blame that action on them? They're just following their genetic coding, their environmental upbringing, and so my answer to a question like that is, look, we do not know all the cause and effects of some individual's life, but we do know that things like shaming works. We can do trial and error. Human beings can recognize patterns. And so when a society shames or blames certain individuals for certain actions, that becomes a cause. It becomes an effect. We cause an effect on other human beings, which may lead to a desired behavior within a community. So in other words, this whole idea of blaming or praising is like emotional triggers that cause certain behaviors and actions. Now, we don't know for sure if it's going to happen or not, but if as a society we let's say do a certain thing to people who do certain actions, let's say jail them or capital punishment or whatever, it may have an effect to prevent certain actions in the future. So that's why we would still say, shame on you, or great job, right on. We still praise people. We still blame people for certain actions because it's just like, with dogs, how you train dogs. You reward behavior you want and you punish behaviors you don't.
I mean, the shock factor comes in saying something like, if somebody murdered my
Because we're just like dogs. You're not special.
family tomorrow, the worst I could feel rationally, I mean, emotionally is another story, but the worst I could feel rationally for the person who murdered my family is sorry for them, because they're just a victim of their circumstance. Yeah. They didn't choose to have the genetics that they have. They didn't choose to have the upbringing and the predispositions to violence, and the desires to commit murders. It's not their fault. Like, it just sucks for everyone involved. It sucks for me, it sucks for my family, and it sucks for them, because they're going to have to rot in prison now.
And even the emotions you're feeling are handed down to you by the universe.
Exactly.
It's all kind of been set in stone from time immemorial. But here's the problem. I think the problem for you is much deeper than that. And I haven't seen many videos where you've responded to this issue, which is that if there's no free will, then I don't see how reason functions, full stop. So when you say you're an atheist or agnostic or whatever, and even just making this...
Yeah, did you hear what he said? If there's no free will, there's no reason, full stop?
Then I don't see how reason functions, full stop. So when you say you're an atheist or agnostic or whatever...
Yeah, and I would say just the opposite. I would say if there is free will, well, it depends on how you define free will. I think Justin defines free will as the ability to have done otherwise. But the whole idea of determinism is basically that there's reasons, there's causes for certain effects. And I think that's about it. So there's either causes or there's no causes, and it's random or arbitrary.
And even just making the statement that free will does not exist, the only way you can come to believe that, or to believe, or to say I'm an atheist, is through presumably a process of reason and evidence. But if everything we think and say and do is predetermined, that's all been predetermined by a non-rational process, and therefore I can't see how we ground the idea of coming to...
Okay, so if you ever hear this line from a Christian, here's how I would answer it. I don't think Alex says this. No, I know Alex doesn't say this, but listen to what he says here, and I'm going to give him my answer.
Determined. That's all been predetermined by a non-rational process, and therefore I can't see how we ground the idea of coming to evidential, reasonable conclusions in a universe which doesn't allow for free will.
Yeah,
okay, so what Justin Brierley is saying here is if there is no free will, there's no rationale, there's no reasoning. You're just doing what you're determined to do. If there's no free will, then basically there's no rationale. Here's how I would tackle this one. I would use basically different versions of Christianity against Justin here. If Justin Brierley, on a small chance you hear this, if God set up situations in a person's life that led them to believe something, and then God maybe brought someone into a person's life that led them to believe something else. And it's just a chain of events where God actively caused certain people to lead or guide, certain ideas to pop into their heads, certain things that they see, that God caused all those things that led up to them saying, oh yeah, okay, I believe that, which caused them to believe that, which caused them to believe that, to that they finally become convinced that a certain proposition is true. So I'm not talking about naturalism here. I'm talking about your God exists, but he's been active. I think Justin Brierley believes in a God that's not deistic, that a God that's active in people's lives. So here we have a situation where God is tremendously active in the life of an individual that actually leads them to be convinced of the core propositions that Christianity is true, and they become a Christian out of their own free will. But God actually caused every step of the way to lead them and to guide them to believe this, to be convinced. So it wasn't arbitrary, it wasn't random. There was a cause for everything, every step of the way. Did those people not use reason? Did those people who became Christians not use rationality? Remember, God caused these things to happen to them. God drew that person to himself. I'm talking Calvinistically, but not really. I'm trying to play both sides of the fence here for Christians. But here's the problem with what Justin Brierley is saying. He's saying that without free will, you cannot have reasoning and rationale. But I'm saying that even within the Christian worldview, Christians believe that you can have reasoning and rationale, and still God is sovereign and controlling everything, causing things to happen. So now just substitute naturalism for God. That there's cause and effects that lead people, there's reasons, in other words, that lead people to be convinced of certain propositions or not convinced of certain propositions. Now, if you say that the Christian, that God leads and directs and draws upon himself, they're still using their reasoning and rationale, even though God caused every step of the way, then why can't that be true for naturalism? That certain chain of events happened, and there was still reasoning and rationale taking place.
Interesting point. I think it's similar but not the same as something like the fallacy of composition, to say that because we come from irrational origins, the result can't be rational. I think that rationality is a product of naturalism, so I don't think it's a problem to say that that rationality has arisen from the non-rational. In the same way that I don't think that any individual atom is conscious, but if you put enough atoms together in the right formation in our brains, then it gives rise to consciousness, even though the components are not themselves conscious, just as no molecule of water is itself wet, despite the composition being... And it would be a similar argument to say, like, well, it's constituted of...
Isn't it true, though, that if determinism is true, which I think you believe is the case...
I don't necessarily believe that's the case, and I can tell you why, but well, I mean, look, so either the law of... a fundamental law of logic is that P is true or not true. It's one or the other, and it can't be anything else. Now, determinism is either true or not true, so the universe is either determined or it's indeterminate. If it's determined, then we're following on a chain of causation and we have no control. If it's indetermined, then by definition there has to be an element of randomness, and randomness by definition you don't have any control over either. So
but either way,
it's logically true. But it makes it kind of logically true that free will can't exist.
Right. But either way you get to it, determinism or kind of randomness, free will doesn't exist. And the problem for me is that the very basis on which you come to your decisions has to involve free will at some level, because you have weighed up the evidence and decided that it's unlikely that God exists. You're therefore an atheist. You've looked at the evidence from the universe and science and everything else and said, looking at all this, I don't think free will exists. But in the very process of making those decisions, you are using a process which has to be free to make any sense, because you have to have the ability to choose one or the other. But if determinism is true, or free will simply doesn't exist, you never had a choice. You were always going to be an atheist. I was always going to be a Christian. It basically boils down to the way...
Yeah, and there's some versions of Christianity that believe just that, Justin Brierley. And so if you're an atheist listening, I would really push this fact upon guys like Justin Brierley, that there are Christians, they call themselves Calvinists, who don't believe in that you could have done otherwise type of free will. That ultimately God is sovereign, he chooses whom he chooses to become Christians and others not. But that doesn't mean there's no rationality, that doesn't mean there's no reason, and that doesn't even mean that they're not morally responsible for their actions, even though God created some people for destruction. They just accept it. Another way to answer this issue is, look, the chain of cause and effect is so complex and so complicated that you can almost, whether determinism is true or not, and I don't even know what free will would actually look like. Even if you believe in free will that you could have done otherwise, there's still reasons. There's still reasons for why you believe things. There's still causes for why you believe things. And I think that's basically what determinists are saying, that there's a cause and effect taking place. And if you're saying that free will is something other than that it's just arbitrary, that you just, I don't know why I believe it, I just believe it. I don't think that's the type of free will that Justin Brierley is talking about.
Our brains work. It's nothing to do with us arriving at rational conclusions from evidence. And for me, that undercuts it undercuts naturalism, full stop. Because if you've arrived at the belief that naturalism is true by a process which is itself non-rational and in which free will can't exist, I then don't understand how you can have any confidence in your belief in naturalism, because you haven't actually arrived at it by a rational process.
Do you choose to become convinced of an argument's conclusion?
Well, I choose to look at the evidence and decide whether it makes sense.
But do you get to choose what convinces you and what doesn't?
Yeah, I think I do.
Okay, so here's...
Great question by Alex. Do you choose to become convinced of certain arguments? And he says, yes, I do choose to be convinced. No, you do not, Justin. And I think if I remember correctly, so this is one of those trap questions where I will, Alex seems like he has a nice persona, and this is why he has a big following, I think. But really, this is a setup question. And I would put my cards on the table and say, Justin Brierley, I'm about to trap you. Embrace the trap.
Here's an argument that God doesn't exist. There's evil and suffering in the world, therefore God does not exist. Just choose, for the purpose of argument here, just choose to be convinced of that for a second.
Choose to be convinced that
that God doesn't exist.
God doesn't exist.
Just do that real quick.
Well, obviously I can't choose in that sense to be convinced of that.
So basically, in that sense, this was a trap question, and here Justin Brierley just did it. He just did a complete 180, and so that's brilliant by Alex O'Connor. Let me rewind it.
Choose to become convinced of an argument.
Actually arrived at it by a rational process.
Do you choose to become convinced of an argument's conclusion?
Well, I choose to look at the evidence and decide whether it makes sense.
But do you get to choose what convinces you and what doesn't?
Yeah, I think I do.
Yes, I do choose what convinces me.
Okay, so here's an argument that God doesn't exist. There's evil and suffering in the world, therefore God does not exist. Just choose, for the purpose of argument here, just choose to be convinced of that for a second.
Choose to be convinced that
God doesn't exist.
God doesn't exist.
Just do that real quick.
Well, obviously I can't choose in that sense to be convinced of.
You went from yes to no in, what was that, under 60 seconds?
Of that.
Right. So you're actually not, there's no level of choice when it comes to actually becoming convinced of a proposition. So all of the propositions that you believe, you didn't choose to believe.
Well, I did. I chose them in a process. I mean, just simply giving me two propositions, I'm not going to suddenly change the belief that I've arrived at over a period of time.
But why not?
This is brilliant by Alex. Justin Brierley, did you choose to be born? No. Did you choose your parents? No. Did you choose how you were raised by your parents? No. Did you choose certain illnesses or certain things to happen to you that were caused by other human beings that you don't have control over? No. Do you choose what thoughts pop into your head? No. Do you choose the weather? Do you choose certain nutrition in foods that, you might choose the foods you eat, I guess, but there's so many factors, like your health, your environment. There's so many things, Justin, that you had no control over. And yet, but you feel like you do. And I understand it. Like, it's like the Matrix movie. What was the line that Neo says? It's like, I feel like I want to be in control.
Because there is a process of evaluation and looking and reasoning.
I mean, the answer to me is
to get there.
Because it's unconvincing, right? It's not convincing enough for me to just say there's evil in the world, therefore God doesn't exist. But you don't get to choose whether or not it's convincing. And if I make that argument more complicated, if I say, well, evil exists in the world and it's unnecessary and God doesn't exist, okay, still not convinced. And let's add a premise like, and if God is ultimately good, then he will eliminate all unnecessary evil, and you make it more and more complicated. And eventually, you might turn around and say, actually, that's a convincing argument.
Right.
I'm convinced that God doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But you don't get to choose any part of whether or not that chain of reasoning convinces you. You are just led to that conclusion. Like if I present an argument that you find convincing, you have no choice but to just become convinced of that conclusion. And that's what happens in all rational processes. The choice, I see where you think the choice lies, which is the choice to kind of weigh up the sides. And I would argue that you actually don't have a choice to do that, because everything is ultimately out of your control. And I'm talking like everything to the extent that you didn't choose to sit in that.
And what I would add here to what Alex is saying is the chain of cause and effect is so complex that we just don't know what certain causes will have what certain effects. And so this is why we're not fatalists. This is why we just don't walk around like zombies. It's like, if I believe that being a non-Christian is better than being a Christian, it's better for society, for example, I will still make arguments, still say the things I say, in hopes that my cause causes an effect in others. And that over a accumulation of different arguments, different thoughts, different anecdotes, that people might change their mind.
Exactly. The problem is that the person who any position at all, whether you're Christian, atheist, or whatever, you didn't have any choice in it. If free will doesn't exist,
yeah, that is interesting wallpaper, right, JD?
It could never have been different. And so the problem for me is that I often hear atheists saying, show me the evidence, show me the reasoning, and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And the problem is, if an atheist also believes there's no such thing as free will, then they're asking for an impossibility, because none of us arrive at it by a process of reasoning. And
no, but they do. They arrive at the process of reasoning, even though they don't get to choose whether or not the reasoning convinces them. So the reason why I would say to you...
One thing I would say here also is that this is very crude, but I think there's some scientific evidence for this. The difference between intuition, gut reactions and intuition, and reasoning is time. It's just how fast you do it. It's like, what do they call it, level 1 versus level 2 reasoning. It's the fact that, let's say someone can come up behind me and go, boo, and I just react and scream or something. I'm not a screamer. Versus me trying to figure out a calculus problem. The difference there is just how fast your brain works. And those slower, methodical type thinking processes we call reasoning. And the really quick stuff we call just intuition or gut reactions.
Try and give me an argument that convinces me for Christianity is because I recognize that I don't get to choose what's convincing, and that it might be within your capability to produce an argument that I have to accept. And so I'm not asking you an impossibility. It's not the case that I always have to be an atheist, because you can produce reasoning.
You don't. That makes out, though, that I am capable of changing your mind by an argument, and that you could have thought otherwise. Okay, that there's a sort of sense in which...
not necessarily. It doesn't mean that I could have thought otherwise had you said something different, but you couldn't have said something different. So actually, maybe that's where the confusion lies.
Okay.
Like, I'm not saying that that's. I think that might be the point. It's hard to phrase. If you present an argument that convinces me that Christianity exists, it is perfectly possible that had you presented a different argument, I may have not become convinced. But the impossibility lies in the fact that you couldn't have presented the other argument. Now, you could say that logically speaking, if you had, then I'd have not become convinced or done differently. But that's just like saying... Yeah,
this is where, in my opinion, the conversation's getting muddy and hard to follow.
If things had gone differently, then they would have gone differently. That's the case. Like, if you chose to get the bus instead of the train, then you'd have got the bus. Like, who cares? Like, that's...
Yeah, I think if I was Alex, I would just... To a guy like Justin, I would say, whether we're free in the ultimate sense, the ability to do otherwise or not, we live our lives like, okay, we're responsible for our actions that we could have done otherwise, even if maybe that's not true. But we just live our lives because it's so complex, the cause and effect relationships. It's so complex that we just live our lives like we could have done otherwise. And I think this type of... the way to think about this is good, and a lot of Christians kind of relate to it, because even the Calvinists who think that God is really sovereign, they would say almost the exact same thing. Maybe this person is a Christian because God chose them, and they couldn't have not been a Christian, that they were written in the Lamb's book of life before the creation of the universe, and so it's a done deal. But we don't know that. Only God knows God's mind. We don't know that, so we live our lives like we couldn't choose to become a Christian or not. But ultimately, from God's perspective, before the creation of the universe, it was all set. This is really how a Calvinist thinks. And this is really not that much different than what a determinist might say.
That's not a relevant point to make.
Well, it seems relevant to me in as much as I think, if you have seem to have arrived at the positions you take through a process of logic and reasoning. Mm-hmm. Okay. And my simple point is only that I feel like I'm repeating myself, so forgive me if I am, but is that process requires you to have been able to choose.
Why?
Because that's what reasoning is. It's the ability.
Yeah, see, he's just defining reasoning as the ability to have done otherwise. And if you can't do otherwise, then it's not reasoning. And again, at this point, I would say if God caused certain things in your life, Justin Brierley, to lead you in certain conclusions, did you reason along the way, or did you become just a vegetable human being at that point because God is leading and directing you in certain directions, causing you to think in certain ways?
Ability to choose between alternatives on the basis of the best evidence.
Well, I'm not sure. I think reason is that is often what is like entailed by the process of reasoning. It's the experience of choosing an option. But it's conceivable that reason can exist in isolation. Like reason is an attempt to know truth. So like I don't understand why you need the option to have reasoned differently. If the whole point of reason is to get to what we believe to be truth and objective truth, then if our reason is functioning properly, then we must arrive at that conclusion.
If it's functioning properly.
If it achieves the goal we want it to achieve, which often practically it doesn't, then it has to achieve the same point. If there is an objective standard of truth, and you and I are both using reason, and the point of our using reason is to achieve that objective standard of truth, then our goal is to get to that point and nothing else.
Right.
You don't need the option to get it wrong in order to get it right.
I mean, all it strikes me though is that all of this seems to be, completely arbitrary. If we were always going to take the position we take because of the physical nature of the universe, you were always going to be there making your argument. I was always going to be here making my argument. And for me, I then don't understand how that equates to being a rational process, because as I've heard you say in
yeah, remember what I said earlier, that you'll hear this from Christians a lot, is I don't understand, I can't explain.
And for me, I then don't understand how that equates to being a rational process, because
I don't understand how it can be rational if it's determined.
As I've heard you say in videos, things could never have been different to the way they are. Mm-hmm. So in what sense did you have any control over your choice to be an atheist?
Oh, I had no control over it.
Right.
But that's just the point. It's like.
But then you haven't arrived at it by a rational process, as far as I can see.
Well, I have. Just because I'm not in control of it doesn't mean it's irrational.
Yeah. So it's the difference between guys like Justin, guys like Alex and me is it's just definitions. It's by definition, Justin is saying if it's not free, if you can't do otherwise, it's not rational. And guys like Alex and myself say no, just because it's determined, it still can be rational. And especially if you define rationality as thinking processes at a slowed down methodical rate versus, let's say, an intuitive gut reaction type decision or process. I think I'm going to leave it there. I think Alex did a great job with Justin. I think, man, from the fence-sitting Christian point of view, watching an interview like this, a fence-sitting Christian is going to see Justin kind of backpedaling on that. Yeah, I can choose what I'm convinced of, and then within seconds later saying, well, no, I can't choose to not believe in God. They're going to go, wow, maybe I'm not as free as I think I am. And then when it comes to the moral issue, the conversation they had in the beginning part, I think a lot of fence-sitting Christians realize you don't need a belief in a deity to treat your fellow man properly. And so the whole idea of needing God for morality is just not there. And the whole idea of being able to justify it or ground it in a deity is not necessary. You can have other groundings that may not be as effective to certain people's opinions, but you can still have different groundings. So I honestly think that conversations like this are going to lean towards the atheistic worldview or the agnostic worldview more than the Christian one. I almost dare to say that Christians should not even engage in conversations like this because they're so open and transparent that people who are truly fence-sitting, I honestly don't think it's going to lean in Justin's direction. But if there's a fence-sitting Christian who's needy, who needs this idea of feeling special by a deity who's created them in his image, then they're going to lean Justin's way because they need it to survive. So I'm going to go to the gym now because I have been determined to get a workout in tonight. With my daughter. We're going to make some gains. Dave Robertson, you don't believe in eternal torment? You should. I think that's the main feature of Christianity. That's what Christianity has going for it. Because if you don't have eternal torment, why become a Christian? Just for heaven? Come on. Really? What is it like to, from an ex-Christian point of view, to believe that Pharaoh had helpers that performed actual magic? Well, Raphael, Christians don't want to admit this, but they're not really monotheistic. They believe there's one big main God, but most Christians, whether they admit it or not, believe in many gods. They're called demons. And so they would believe Pharaoh had demons doing the sorcery and the tricks and stuff. Christians, most Christians I would say are henotheists, not monotheists. The New Testament, their own book says that the God of this world is Satan. It uses the word God. There's big God, Yahweh, and there's little God, Satan. And then littler gods under Satan called demons. Captain O, why do you attempt to provide an explanation for why determinists hold people blameworthy? Aren't they just determined to do so? Oh, I attempt it because I'm determined to attempt it. Have a good night, guys. Take care.